Been looking forward to this for a few weeks now. I want to thank Mr. Frazier for coming too. I think that's cool that he decided to come. And our guests from the Gadsden Times and Birmingham News are here as well, so it's going to be a fun afternoon. We're going to have a talk time. We're going to take a break where we just sort of stretch and everything, and we'll resume it, and then we'll have a question and answer session afterwards. So I hope you guys listen, pay attention, and over our studies over the past couple of weeks, you come with a couple of questions for Reverend Carpenter. So before we get started, I want to welcome you guys to the Episcopal Church of the Resurrection. This is, my church, and I'm very proud of it, and I'm very excited to have you all here. But I want to introduce you to the gentleman. He'll be introducing our speaker today, Father Michael Goldsmith, our rector here at Resurrection. Awesome guy, and he's going to tell you a little bit about our speaker today.
Thank you, Jason. Welcome to the Episcopal Church of the Resurrection. You may not know it, but there are several of your classmates that go to church here. Would you like to stand up, Taylor? No? Taylor and Mary Grace and Bailey. And I think did I miss anybody? Okay. They would love to tell you about this church. And if you have any questions about the Episcopal Church, you can call me anytime. Jason has my phone number. You are welcome to come and worship with us anytime. We have church on Sunday mornings, as you would expect, at 10 o'clock, and we have church Wednesday evenings at 6 o'clock. And there's free pizza at 5 o'clock, too, so you can come for that. I know, really, I know. So what I'd like to do is just tell you a little bit about Doug Carpenter, but most of what he's going to talk about is sort of introducing himself and his life. So my introducing him is a little superfluous, as it's a big word, right? Have y'all learned that word? Yeah, okay. So what I would like to do, and then we'll pray, and then I'll turn it over to Doug. But I'm glad you're here. Really glad you're here. Part of what we like to do in this church is welcome folks and provide places for conversation. That's what I hope we will be facilitating today, is a conversation. And so we're excited that you're here. Doug Carpenter has been a priest in the Episcopal Church for 53 years. And like myself, both of our fathers are priests as well. And so there's a lot of history there that Doug will tell you a lot about. Doug, he probably won't tell you this part, but he is one of the patriarchs of the Episcopal Church in our diocese, the Diocese of Alabama. He is very well respected and loved throughout the diocese, and really I would say probably throughout the country. He is a good man, a good Christian, and a good friend. So we are all honored to have him with us today. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Lord God, we give you thanks. We give you thanks for our many, many blessings. We give you thanks for our brains that allow us to think, for hearts that allow us to feel, and for the strength to do both. We give you thanks for Doug and his ministry. We ask you to open our hearts and our minds so we may hear what you would like us to hear. Especially give you thanks today for teachers. We ask you to watch over them, give them strength and courage and patience. All this we ask in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Doug, welcome.
Well, one more thing about Episcopalians. Courtney Cox Arquette, y'all know who she is? CC. She was one of the stars on Friends on television. Well, when she married David Arquette, they asked me if I would marry them in San Francisco. And I said, why San Francisco? They said, because everybody knows us down where all the Hollywood people are, and we want to have kind of a quiet wedding. We don't want a lot of crowd and a lot of publicity. So don't tell anybody about it. Well, we carried that off pretty well. My wife and I went out to San Francisco, and met a lot of movie stars and all the people that played on Friends, and came time for the wedding, and it had been kept very secret. No newspaper reporters, no photographers around, nothing. So I was walking up the steps to the Episcopal Cathedral that's there in San Francisco, and here came a newspaper reporter running, trying to catch me. I said, "Oh my goodness." He said, "I've got to ask you a question." And I wasn't supposed to say anything. And here's what his question was: "What is an Episcopalian?" That's what he asked me. So not everybody knows who we are. Well, the letter from the Birmingham jail is one of the most important pieces of history that we have in this country, as you all know. And Martin Luther King, of course, is an enormous hero of most of us. And so I want to give you a little texture to where all that comes from and what I know about it. Actually, that letter was addressed to 8 clergy. And my father was the first one on the list. Did you all know that? A lot of the times when you see the letter now, it doesn't include who it was addressed to, but it was addressed to 8 white clergymen in Birmingham, and he criticized them for being so moderate, as you've seen in the letter. But what we realized is that, of course, that letter is not addressed to them. He used them as kind of a stepping stone to get it out. It's addressed to the nation. I mean, he talked about how those clergy were too slow, we need to move things faster. But also, he thought the president was too slow. He thought the whole country was too slow. And so that letter, which starred in the Birmingham jail, is really seen as a letter to this entire nation. And it catapulted the campaign in Birmingham to be a national campaign. That's really what really put it as a national campaign, is that letter and the events which took place in Birmingham at that time. Well, who am I and why should I be talking about it? Well, in 1963, when all the things were going on in the city of Birmingham, I was in Huntsville, Alabama. And I want to tell you that being in Huntsville in 1963 was like being 1,000 miles away from Birmingham and Selma. We were putting a man on the moon. Y'all remember about that? That's what we were doing in Huntsville, and people were moving in by the droves. The year I moved to Huntsville in early 1963, the town grew by 20%. There was 100,000 when I went up there, and by the end of the year it was 120,000. So that's where we were thinking in Birmingham, and I often feel guilty that I was not more conscious of Birmingham and Selma and some of the other places. But that's where I was. But my connection was strong because my father, and I'm going to tell you his name because it ties in with some very interesting things. His name was Charles Colcock Jones Carpenter, Sr. He was the Episcopal bishop of Alabama from 1938 to 1968. That's a long time for a man to travel around the whole state of Alabama. He loved the state of Alabama. He was a big fella. He was only 6'4", but he looked a lot bigger because his head was big and his arms were long, and he had a strong presence. So if you walked down 20th Street in Birmingham with him in those days, everybody would speak to him. Everybody knew him. He was very prominent. So when Martin Luther King addresses his letter to him, and there's other 7, it caught a lot of attention there. Now, when I started my ministry in 1960, I was in Bruton and Andalusia, Alabama, down South Alabama. To give you an idea of what things were like in Alabama in those days, I hate to even remember this, but I went to register to vote in Bruton in 1960. And I was given a test to take. And I looked at it. Now, by that time, I had graduated from Princeton University. I'd been in the Army. I graduated from graduate school, Virginia Theological Seminary. And there's no way I could have answered the questions on that test. Now, I'm going to use a bad word here, but you all will understand it in context. A lady saw me puzzled. She came over and grabbed it and said, "Oh, that's the nigger test." That was absolute truth. That tells you how far we've come in some ways. That was Brewton, Alabama, 1960. I was there for 3 years before I moved to Huntsville. Now, I want to give you an image to begin with of Bernice King. Do y'all know who Bernice King is? She's Martin Luther King's youngest child. She was born less than 2 months before Martin Luther King was in jail in Birmingham. Think sometime about Mrs. King. Here's her husband having the campaign on Birmingham. That's a place where a lot of black people had been bombed and killed. I mean, just telling you like it was. And Bernice was being born. So she's his youngest daughter, and she's an ordained minister now. Well, on the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King beginning to write his letter in the Birmingham jail, April 16th, 1963 is when he started writing that letter. And he wrote most of it in jail. It's an amazing letter. He touched it up afterwards and worked on it a little bit. And if you want to know the whole process of that letter being written, there's a book called Blessed Are the Peacemakers. And Jonathan Bass, who's a professor at Samford University in Birmingham, wrote that. He started writing that when he was a teenager. He has in the back of his book all the details of how that letter was produced and finally went out. And so on April 16th, 2013, I knew that I would be involved in a lot of things in Birmingham because I'm pretty well known there now. I've lived there now straight from 1973 to the present. I asked one of my grandchildren who was in Memphis to come down and spend the day with me. And his mother came. And here's how the day went. At breakfast, I had breakfast with Bernice King. Now, this may not seem such a big event for you, but here's why it was such a big event for me. You read in Martin Luther King's letter how he said at the end that he hoped, when things settled down a little bit, to meet all the people he had addressed in the letter personally. Do you remember that little part in there? That he hoped to meet them personally? Well, that never happened, and it's easy to see why it happened. Because that letter and the events in Birmingham that I'll talk about catapulted the whole civil rights movement to a national basis. I mean, he was really called on everywhere after that. Soon after that, the March on Washington took place. Soon after that, the 16th Street Baptist Church was blown up in Birmingham. So for Martin Luther King, you can see how he wouldn't have time to come back and meet all those people individually. I think he wanted to. My father's life was pretty busy after that too, because he headed up the committee that was decided on when the Birmingham leaders made the accord with the civil rights leaders. He headed up the committee that was to keep civil rights going. It was an integrated meeting to keep civil rights going in Birmingham. They had a funny way of composing it. They found out what percentage of Birmingham was black and what percentage was white, and that was the percentage that they made up this committee. Two of the others who the letter was addressed to were on that committee, moving things along. Then the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed in September, and they had all their meetings in my father's office after that to figure out what to do to repair the church and to take care of the people. So they never met. One of my older friends in Anniston just sighed one day and said, I wish Martin Luther King and Bishop Carpenter could have really known each other. It would have made a huge difference. But the way it turned out, everything worked for the civil rights movement. Well, so when Bernice King and I were having breakfast and she wanted to have a conversation, I didn't know somebody was taking a movie of that. But it was just wonderful to be able to have a personal conversation with her, since our fathers never did. And she put it on her Facebook the next day, and lots of people have looked at it. If you want to see me talking with Bernice King, all you have to do is Google in Bernice King, The Meeting. And I'll pop up in a video with her. That was so symbolic that in 2013, the children of Martin Luther King and Bishop Carpenter were there embracing each other and having a wonderful conversation. We talked about our fathers. I told her about being at her father's funeral just 5 years after he wrote the letter. I went over to Atlanta from Huntsville. She was only 5 years old at the time of her father's funeral. So that's kind of an image of that I'll work from as we go along through this, of me and Bernice. Later in that day of April 16th, 2013, she made a speech at the Birmingham jail. It was a great speech, and she put a plaque up. There'd never been a plaque up at that jail. It's an old kind of rundown-looking building now. And, of course, I was there, and in her speech, she quoted something I had said to her when we had breakfast together. And I want to tell you what I said to her and what she quoted there. The quotation is, "You can't go back and make a new start, but everybody can start here and make a new beginning, make a new ending. You can't go back and make a new start, but any of us can start here and make a new ending." And so that kind of became a theme between us, that both of us had regrets for so much that went on in the past, but you don't go around regretting the past. You learn how to live toward the future. Well, later in the day, she and I and others were on a panel discussion at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. How many of you have been to that church? A few of you have. It's one of the most historic places, of course, in the world now, that 16th Street Baptist Church. And, of course, you can't go there without a great deal of sadness as well. Well, on the course of that day, Bernice and I became friends. So on Martin Luther King Day this year, in January, she invited me to be one of the speakers at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. Now, the Ebenezer Baptist Church is where the Kings have been. Daddy King, who was Martin Luther King Sr., is still, there are pictures of him everywhere over there. It's kind of the King's church. And I think that really was the church that Martin Luther King belonged to officially when he came to Birmingham. And she asked me to be one of the speakers over there, which was great. I couldn't turn that down. There were a lot of speakers, though. The service lasted 4 hours. Have y'all ever been to a church service that lasted 4 hours? That's not as unusual in the black community as it is in the white. And there were some people who were there that would leave after a while. In fact, the governor of Georgia probably was glad later that he did leave, because when the preacher at that church, the Ebenezer Baptist Church, when it came his time to preach, he didn't have much good to say about the governor of the state and how slow things were going and so forth. But it was a wonderful service, and so glad that I was there to be able to talk a little bit and put some of these things in context. On the way home, my wife and I were driving home, and since nobody had lunch, we'd been in church 4 hours, and then afterwards there were things. We stopped at a little restaurant to have lunch, and this fellow came running up to us. He was a black preacher. He introduced himself. He said, "I've been watching you all day." I said, "Were you at the service?" He said, "No. My wife took the day off and we're watching on television." I said, "How did you recognize me then?" He said, "Your stick." I had this stick, and a lot of people recognize me by this now more than they recognize me by myself. I saw your stick in the video, and so he rushed over and we had a good conversation, and all these connections are so important. Let me talk just for a minute, and you'll at first wonder why I'm doing this. I want to talk a little bit about Michelle Obama and myself. Now, I don't know her. We graduated from the same college, but I don't know her. Of course, she's a lot younger than I am. But here's why I'm going to bring her up. Her great-great-grandparents lived in the kind of Charleston, Savannah area before the Civil War. Now, you may not know this, but South Carolina was one of the wealthiest places in this country before the Civil War. That wealth was made on the backs of black slaves, no question about it. They produced that wealth. Michelle's great-great-grandparents were slaves before the Civil War in that area. My great-great-grandparents were slave owners in that area at the same time. They were down in Liberty County, Georgia, which was close to Savannah, Georgia, to give you some context. And here she is, the wife of our president. Her parents, her ancestors, her great-great-grandparents were slaves in that area, where my parents, great-great-grandparents, owned slaves. Well, there's a lot to that story, and you'll see why I'm bringing it in. My great-great-grandfather, his name was Charles Colcock Jones. Now, I told you that my father's name was Charles Colcock Jones Carpenter, Sr., right? I'm going to connect that a little bit because it's very interesting. When Charles Colcock Jones was at Princeton Seminary, and he had been an orphan from early on, he began getting letters from Liberty County, Georgia, saying, you just inherited a plantation, or you just inherited so many slaves. Slaves at that time were called property. And they were property. They were owned by white people. So while he was in seminary, he was inheriting, and he probably inherited so much of this, 3 plantations, because both his parents had died, so things that would have gone to them came to him. And he began thinking about it, and he was very opposed to slavery. We know a lot about him because we have a lot of his letters to his fiancée, who was in Liberty County, Georgia at the time. And in his letters to her, he says that he thinks that slavery will be the undoing of the United States. It'll destroy the country. He's very much opposed to slavery. So what was he to do? He kept inheriting slaves and inheriting plantations. Well, some people had a real hard time. Even President Lincoln thought over, what would I do if I was a slave owner? I wouldn't be rich enough to take him to Liberia, for example. Now, you may know something about, well, you know a lot about Liberia now because of Ebola, right? You know kind of what Liberia is like. The United States had the arrogance before the Civil War to just say that freed slaves could be taken there. Well, people already owned the property. It was a bad scene in many ways. It is the reason for a lot of the civil wars that have gone on in Liberia, and there have been many. Well, my great-great-grandfather had a friend who was from the Charleston area, who was very wealthy. And his fiancée was in Savannah, and she was very wealthy. They had a lot of money. So what they did was to take their slaves to Liberia. There's been a very interesting book that came out just last year called By the Rivers of Water by Erskine Clark. And he writes about this period before the Civil War and the slave trade coming to America and the freed trade, freed slaves going to Liberia. And I talked to him a couple of times while he was writing that book. It's really worth reading. It's called By the Rivers of Water, and it's by Erskine Clark. And it covers those years before the Civil War and what was going on. I talked to him a couple of times. The reason I talked to him is because he's also written a book that's all about my slave-owning family in Liberty County, Georgia. That's a very interesting book, too, called Dwelling Place. Because instead of writing about the white people, he writes more about the slaves and what life was like for them, and got so interested in them. He's a retired professor from Columbia Seminary and a wonderful writer. Well, as I talked to him, he said, one of the things that may come out in my book will surprise people, and it comes from the question, did the slaves who got their freedom and went to Liberia come out better than the slaves who stayed in the United States? Well, you know what the answer is on that, but it's interesting to see how that develops. Now, this Charles Colcock Jones, my great-great-grandfather, not knowing how to get rid of his slaves, and think back, if you freed a slave in Georgia, if you didn't have the money to, say, take them to Liberia, they had to leave the state immediately. A freed slave could not live in Georgia. Where would they go? Couldn't go to South Carolina. Couldn't go to Alabama. It was hostile territory. To free a slave was to put that life in great danger. It was hard to know how to free slaves. Now, if we think back, maybe we can figure some way to do it that they couldn't figure out at the time. But he couldn't figure out how to release all of his slaves without putting them in huge danger. So here's what he did. He went ahead and was ordained as a Presbyterian minister, and he decided that since he didn't know how to release his slaves, he would devote his entire ministry to being the white minister to the slaves of Liberty County, Georgia. There were hundreds and hundreds, thousands of slaves in Liberty County, Georgia. And that's what he did. He helped start little congregations where the slaves could have their own services. He had services all throughout the county. He talked, he lived with the slaves of Liberty County, Georgia, and he was a slave owner. One of his primary locations in Georgia is a place that is now known more as Dorchester than Midway. But the little town there is called Midway, Georgia. It's a very small town in Georgia, but very important. A lot of leaders of this country came from Midway, Georgia. There's a church there that you can still visit where he had a lot of the services with the slaves. He became part of their community. Now, you can go back and say, couldn't he have done something different? In fact, Frederick Douglass, you probably know about the great black leader Frederick Douglass, he criticized him because he said, by making slavery more honorable and doing things for slaves and trying to educate them, you're kind of honoring the institution. It'll take longer for us to do away with slavery if people make it a better thing to be. So he got that criticism even during his lifetime. But here's the connection I'm going to make there. Does the word Dorchester mean anything to you? Midway, Georgia? All right, Dorchester is a place where immediately after the Civil War, a school was built for the former slaves. You can read about the Dorchester School. Nobody can understand how those slaves learned so fast. They caught up with white people quickly. Nobody can understand why Christianity was so important to them since that had been their master's religion. That's still an interesting question that you may want to write a paper on sometime. Why would the ex-slaves take over their master's religion as they did? Well, these people who went to school in Dorchester were ones that my great-great-grandfather had been working with. He died in 1863, 2 years before the Civil War was over. But these were his people that were then in that Dorchester school, now learning and developing. Well, Dorchester's remained a school right there beside Midway, where he's buried in Midway, it was not until the 1940s that Georgia really provided public education for blacks in that community. They stopped the school then because they thought it was better to cooperate with the public education that was developing. We had some experience like that in Birmingham, where the Episcopal Church owned a great black school in Birmingham, and when blacks began to be put into situations in the public schools that were pretty good, we closed that down. People wonder, is that right or wrong? So it's still a question. But Dorchester, after it was no longer a school, became a center for training black people on how to vote and to be citizens and how to live in the whole national community. Andrew Young, do you know that name? Andy Young? He was one of the great civil rights leaders during '63 in Birmingham, and was later the first black mayor of Atlanta, and represented us in the United Nations. And his biography, An Easy Burden, is worth reading, no matter who you are. Andy Young's An Easy Burden. Well, Andy Young started out his ministry working a lot with the National Council of Churches of Christ in America. Now, you all may not know what the National Council of Churches of Christ is, but it was an ecumenical movement that was way over on the liberal side during all of the civil rights era and before. While Andy Young was working for youth through the National Council of Churches of Christ, he got to be very good friends with a good friend of mine, who's still a great friend of mine, Peggy Horn. She later married, and she's Peggy Horn Roop. And Peggy Horn was the youth advisor for the Episcopal youth in Alabama. And she and Andy Young got to be good friends. All right, so early in 1963, you have over there at Dorchester Martin Luther King, Andy Young, Fred Shuttlesworth from Birmingham, Wyatt T. Walker, Ralph Abernathy. Some of those names don't mean that much to you, but if you'd lived in 1963, you knew all those names because they were the big leaders in the civil rights movement. And so they're there planning the campaign on Birmingham. Well, you probably know that Martin Luther King had tried a campaign on Albany, Georgia. Do you know about that? He had a campaign on Albany, Georgia, which was supposed to do what the campaign in Birmingham did. Do you know why it didn't work? The mayor of Albany realized that he was kind to the demonstrators and nobody, was mean or ugly. It wouldn't get any publicity, and then it wouldn't work. So the campaign on Albany failed, and Martin Luther King was so intent on having the campaign on Birmingham, which he called the most segregated city in the United States, to work, that he called these people to Dorchester to plan. While they were planning, Martin Luther King said, look, we're not going to take on just the whole city of Birmingham. We'll be taking on all of Alabama. And he probably named George Wallace and Bull Connor and some of these people. Who do y'all know in Birmingham? And so Andy Young said, I know. I get kind of choked up when I say Peggy Horn's name, because she's one of the kind of unknown heroes of the civil rights movement. He says, I know a young white lady in Birmingham, Peggy Horn, and wherever she is, I know we can meet safely there. Do you know at that time it was not safe to have an integrated meeting in Birmingham in 1963? The Klan was watching all the time. He said, wherever Peggy Horn is, we can be safe. The place where Peggy Horn was my father's office, Charles Colcock Jones Carpenter, Sr. And the building is called Carpenter House. It's the headquarters for the Episcopal Church in Alabama. So that's where they were able to have integrated meetings prior to the civil rights campaign in Birmingham. I've heard a number of people, and especially since I wrote a book about my father's biography, who have said, do you know that in 1963, there was probably no other place where you could safely have an integrated meeting except in your father's office? And I thought that part of the story needed to be told, because most people see him as a caricature of an inept Southern preacher who Martin Luther King had to chastise. That's where you could have a safe, integrated meeting. Now, that seems funny to us today, because probably today we could meet almost anywhere in Gadsden. You're meeting here. But this wouldn't have happened in Birmingham in '63. So, from Dorchester, where Charles Colcock Jones Sr., the Presbyterian minister, had been the minister to the blacks and influenced them so much, it was against the law to teach black people. You know that? But you could tell them. You couldn't teach them how to write and read, but you could teach them orally, and that's what he did. And so none of these civil rights leaders connected that or knew anything about the fact that they were planning this, where Charles Colcock Jones had been, and were going to carry it out what Charles Colcock Jones Sr. was going to be. Very few of the writers of the civil rights movement made that connection, which is kind of an interesting connection. Although the fellow that wrote the trilogy of the King years, he said he had piles and piles of information about that, but he had already written so much he never included that in there. All right, so that brings you to Birmingham, from Dorchester in Georgia. Now, I was born in Savannah, but moved to Birmingham when I was 3. My father was born in Augusta, Georgia. And Augusta is where a lot of the ex-slaves came looking for work after the Civil War. And he was only one generation removed from plantation life. Isn't that hard to believe, that my father was only one generation removed from plantation life? His mother, as a small child, lived on one of those Jones plantations where they had slaves. Now, why did my father move to Birmingham? That's an interesting question. He was the rector of the largest church in Savannah, Georgia, and just doing great. When he was 35 years old, he only missed by 1 vote being elected the Bishop of Georgia. But he moved to Birmingham. I often wondered about that later, because Birmingham in 1938 was a rough place. I don't know if you all have read a book called Slavery by Another Name by Doug Blackman. It tells how in Birmingham in those years the steel mills and the mining industry would practice peony. They would put black people in jail for no reason. And then the city would fine them, and the steel company would pay the fine in case, if the black person would work for them and work off paying them back, but they never did make enough to pay them back, and they were really running what was really slavery in Birmingham in the early 1900s, and on some of the farms as well. Also, the Ku Klux Klan was active there. And also it was a filthy city because of the steel mines, steel mills, and the mining that was going on there. But we moved there in 1938. My father became the minister of the Church of the Advent, which is downtown Birmingham, right in the middle of downtown Birmingham, where all this is going to take place in 1963. The Ku Klux Klan, after the Second World War, and of course I remember the Second World War well because I was born in 1933, and if we talk some about prejudice, I'll tell you how hard it was to get over prejudice to Oriental people, because I was so carefully taught to be prejudiced against Japanese. After the Second World War, a lot of the black males from Birmingham were coming back. They'd been in the army. They'd gotten education. They were ready to really start leading good lives. So they came back and they married and they needed places to live. During the war years, the city of Birmingham had taken over more and more property for the city. And yes, it's true, in those days, in the late 40s and 50s, black people couldn't live in certain sections and white people couldn't live in certain sections. There were sections where blacks were allowed to live. A lot of that land had been taken away. There wasn't enough room for housing, so the black families started building houses a little closer to the white people, and that's when the bombing started. It was all done by the Ku Klux Klan. There were between 40 and 50 black residences bombed in my hometown in the years after the Second World War. The police could never find enough evidence to convict anybody. Do you believe that? Of course not. But they said they never could find, there was never a conviction. Even as late as 1963, when there was a lot of evidence about the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, neither the local police or the FBI could find enough evidence to convict anybody. The only convictions that took place after the 16th Street bombing was one in the 70s and two after we got into this century. And one person had died in the meantime. All right, so that's what black people were living with, was not knowing when dynamite would go off. A place not too far from where I lived was called Dynamite Hill. And there's a wonderful book written about some of those people there called The Little Giant of Dynamite Hill. All right, my father took an active role against the Ku Klux Klan. That was a dangerous thing to do. We started getting phone calls at our home because after the war, I was still there as a young teenager. And people would threaten his life. And, of course, we would be disturbed about that, but he would say, you don't have to worry about me. Ku Klux Klan people are cowards. They would not dare kill me because they knew something would be done about it. But they'll kill black people. He said they're cowards. They wear hoods and they threaten, but they will not hurt a Protestant white person. They might hurt a Jewish person or a Roman Catholic, but not a white Protestant because they know something will be done about it. So that was part of the situation in Birmingham. And one reason I think that my father and these other 7 white clergy that were dressed by King were a little slow in moving is every time they did anything, it would be not them that got hurt. Well, a lot of preachers did lose their jobs, but nobody got killed. But bombings would take place. So that for them to be aggressive would mean that they suffered nothing, but the white community would suffer. Not enough evidence to convict. All right, you all know that after the Civil War, there was supposed to be a time when we adjusted to the freedom of slaves, but it only went on till 1877. And then you probably know about Jim Crow and segregation. The Jim Crow laws, what they did was to go back and make laws in local places that pretty much made black people as secondary citizens or almost as slaves again. You know where Jim Crow came from, that phrase? There was a dance called the Jim Crow. And a lot of the minstrel shows back in the early 1900s when white people would black their faces up and act like black people, they would dance the Jim Crow, and that somehow took on to a time when the laws against blacks came in. They called them Jim Crow laws. That was going on. All right, so that's kind of what Martin Luther King and his men are up against, and when they come to Birmingham, where the most liberal white leaders in Birmingham were pretty much trying to work within the system, which means within the framework of integration, they were trying to make life better for black people by getting them education and so forth, but they were working in the system. The same as my great-great-grandfather worked within the system of slavery because he didn't know how to change the system. Well, what had to happen was the whole system had to be changed. And so it took a strong force to do that. And that's what the Civil Rights Movement brought to Birmingham. Now, to look at the year 1963, you can see how things almost like magic worked, even when it didn't look like they would. January 14, 1963, George Wallace, in his inauguration speech, preached the white supremacy speech. Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever was his inauguration speech in Alabama. That's hard to believe today, isn't it? Well, 2 days later, these white ministers that Martin Luther King later addressed, 2 days after Martin Luther King's address on January 16th, put a statement in the Birmingham papers It's known as the appeal for law and order and common sense, in which they speak against Wallace's defiance and rebellious and inflammatory statements and urge primarily white people to be obedient to the laws of integrating the schools. Now, Brown versus Topeka, the bill that integrated schools, was in 54. We're in 1963. None of that had happened in Alabama. I was surprised when I went to Virginia that it was even slower in parts of Virginia. So these 8 clergy were appealing to the white community not to break laws on integrating the school and not to use inflammatory statements and so forth. They got a lot of praise for that outside of Birmingham. In Birmingham, they got a lot of hate mail, So these white people, still pretty much working in the framework of integration, have a slower strategy than King has, who's going to come in with civil disobedience and direct but peaceful confrontation. And so in April the 12th, there's a second letter from these white clergy. It wasn't a letter, but it appeared in the newspaper. And the second letter, which is the one that I think you all are going to read, urged the demonstrations to stop for a while to see if the new form of government in Birmingham was going to work. Now, you may not know this, but people had worked hard to change the form of government in Birmingham so that they'd get rid of Bull Connor and his likes. You know the name Bull Connor? He was a mean, tough guy. And they had just changed the rules about how Birmingham would be governed and had an election, and Bull Connor had been ruled out. However, the judicial system was slow in confirming, so Bull Connor, there were actually 2 city councils in Birmingham for a while, and Bull Connor still had the power over the police force and the fire department. So the clergy said, let's hold on and see if the new government's going to work. And things were fairly peaceful up until Easter of 63. By the time a lot of people saw their letter, which said that things had remained fairly peaceful, let's see if we can work it out. By that time, the people saw it around the country. Fire hoses, dogs, y'all know those pictures, right, don't you? So what was tough on Birmingham was good for the nation. That's probably my main theme. Birmingham suffered a lot, but it was good for the nation. If Bull Connor had been ruled out of office before this time, we wouldn't have had the fire hoses and the dogs, and that's what caught the attention of the whole nation. A lot of things worked right. If the white clergy hadn't said, wait, Martin Luther King wouldn't have had all those great statements about we've waited so long. How can we wait longer? How can we wait longer? Everything worked. Television had just started. I mean, can you believe that? 63, I didn't have a television set till well after that. People saw this not only all over the country, but all over the world. And those fire hoses, which didn't really hurt anybody much, and those dogs were such images that it caught the attention of the nation. And President Kennedy, who had been trying to get something passed on civil rights, well, as you know, he was killed in November of that year. And that was a terrible thing, but it helped Johnson pass the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. But in the meantime, other things helped this along. There was an accord on May 10th in Birmingham between the white leaders and the civil rights leaders. And that accord got certain things passed that would happen in the Birmingham area. And this irritated the Ku Klux Klan and their like so much that the day after the accord, bombing started again. Serious bombings. And then, as you know, in September, we had the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, which was a terrible thing. But all these things were so tragic that they caused the Civil Rights Bill of 64 and the Voting Rights Bill of 65 to be passed. So it just kind of seemed to work right. We needed Bull Connor to be so bad, riding around in his tank and with his fire hoses and dogs to catch the attention of people. The whole nation needed to have the attention caught. That's why I say King's letter was really to the whole nation, not just to Birmingham. The whole nation was. That was 1963, 100 years after Lincoln had the Emancipation Proclamation. And that, of course, only covered the rebellious South, but in 1865, all slaves were made free by law. And then, of course, we move on to 1968, and Martin Luther King himself is killed in Memphis. And thinking back over all that, of course, any of us could think back and think we could have done better. There I was, comfortable in Huntsville. I did call down to Selma in 1965 and ask if I came down, if I could help. And the answer I got, we got so many people down here already, it wouldn't make any difference. All of that took place in our time. I don't know what time it is right now. Let me look here and see where to go from here. Okay, I can go on just a few more minutes, you think? All right. Do y'all need a break? Well, let me see. Do you have any questions so far before I want to move into a thing about prejudice next? Any questions? Comments? Yeah. Martin Luther King was killed by a white man who later was in jail for a long time. Can any of you remember his name? James Earl Ray. Yeah, James Earl Ray. And one of King's children, I think, went to prison and talked to him one time. He was in a bathroom window that looked over and could see the Lorraine Hotel. And my son's office is now right across from the Lorraine Hotel. And when he looks out his window, he sees there's quite a museum there now in Memphis of where Martin Luther King was shot and killed there. We've had a lot of violence, and we still have a lot of violence. And I don't know why we can't do something about all these guns that we still have, people killing each other in this country. Good question. James Earl Ray. As you get older, you forget nouns first, and names are nouns. So that's why I have to put notes down everywhere. Any other questions? Let me say a little bit about prejudice. When Stephen Grafman saw that I published a biography of my father, and I've got some up here for $20 if anybody wants one. It tells his whole life and has the parts about 63 and 65 as well. Also, he loved rhetoric, and that's one of the things that you all are studying. When Steve Grafman saw this, he said, my father was the rabbi at Emmanuel Temple in Birmingham, and he was one of the ones named by Martin Luther King. And his father had a little different experience than my father had, because the Jewish people of the North really thought he was a bad man because he was named in Martin Luther King's letter. My father may have gotten as much of that too, but it didn't seem to bother him quite as much because he wasn't just in Birmingham, he was all over the state. But Rabbi Grafman was given a lot of flack, getting a lot of hate letters of people that thought he was too conservative. I was away from the state for a while, and in 1973 I came back, and I went to see Rabbi Grafman. He was the only one of the 8 clergy that was still in Birmingham by 1973. And we had a long talk. And he said, I still get hate mail from Jews from New York. And every time a school reads a letter about Martin Luther King, I get hate mail because they assume I must have been bad to be named. But he was one of the leading liberal forces in Birmingham. All of those 8 thought Martin Luther King did a great letter, but it would have been nice for them if he hadn't singled them out because of their statement in the newspaper. But for the good of the nation, that worked well as well. So Steve Grafman is now writing the biography of Rabbi Milton Grafman. And whereas mine is just a full biography, his is going to really talk about civil rights and be very interesting. He's a lawyer in Washington, D.C., about 10 years younger than I am. So that'll be coming out. Well, let me tell you this interesting little story. Why was my father slower than he should have been in forcing integration to come about? Why couldn't he have moved faster? Well, a man was riding on a train. You know, we used to ride trains all the time in those days. And the train was going so slow. And he says, conductor, can't you go any faster than this? And the conductor said, yeah, I can go a lot faster than this, but I have to stay with the train. Y'all get the point? If white Southerners had moved too fast, they no longer had any influence at that time. And so when Andy Young had a sermon in Atlanta recently to install the new Episcopal bishop there in Atlanta, he held up 2 Episcopal bishops, Church of England bishops, Bishop Tutu, y'all all know Bishop Tutu, and my father. And he said both of those men knew how to lead and still stay with their people. That's worth meditating on, how to lead and still stay with their people. Because there were a lot of things we could have done in those days and lost our people, and then we wouldn't have really had much to do. Even in Huntsville, you had to be careful. I didn't have to be careful. My congregation mostly was working on the space program. But the congregation downtown, one of their ministers went with me to Martin Luther King's funeral. And when he got back, he got a lot of flack for going to Martin Luther King's funeral. He probably lost touch with some of his people. All right, let me tell you about my strongest prejudice. Because you see, I never had to... Oh, I see why I've lost my place here. I'm moving the pages to the wrong side of the notebook here. Let's see what I've left out. Well, I think we've done that pretty well. My prejudice was against Japanese in particular. And I had a hard time with it. And so I want to use that to illustrate for you all what I think is the greatest way to get over prejudice. Now, prejudice is when you think badly of a group of people for no reason except that they're different from you. All these hate groups. Do you know that since President Obama was elected president, the hate groups in this country have jumped up to 900 and something? Why else would that be except the fact that he considers himself a black person? There are 22 hate groups in the state of Alabama. Now, in these hate groups, why do they hate other groups? Mostly they're brainwashed, and they hate them without any reason, but they hate them just because they're different. So during the Second World War, when I was in grade school, we were carefully taught to hate Japanese. And I guess that goes on in wartime, makes it easier to kill people if you hate them. But it really influenced me strongly, so that even by the time I got into my 20s, I was afraid of Oriental people of any kind, and I didn't like them. And I want to tell you a story about how I got over that prejudice, and at the same time, to tell you how I got over my prejudice against old women. Now, for some reason, I'd never been around old women, and I just didn't like them. I didn't real old women, right? So I worked one summer at Topeka State Mental Hospital in Kansas. And for some reason, the head chaplain there didn't like me. I found out later that he didn't like anybody whose father was a bishop. That was his prejudice. But anyway, soon after I got there, he took me up to the oldest wing of the hospital where the oldest women were. And we went in. I hadn't had much training. He locked one steel door behind us, and then we went through another steel door and closed that behind us. And I looked down this long hall of old, really old women. And I found out that I was scared, and I just didn't want to walk down there. And then I looked around, and he'd gone and locked the door and left me in there, and I was standing there. What was I supposed to do? Well, sometimes wonderful things just happen. And this Japanese nurse walked over and touched me on the arm and said, "If you take them one at a time, you'll be okay." Boy, I've remembered that 1,000 times since then. If you take them some busy days, if you take it one at a time, you'll be okay. Well, I was obedient to her, and I started going to those old women. Some of them were blind, and some of them were crazy, and I would talk to them one at a time. That got to be my favorite ward, and I also got over my prejudice against Japanese women. So I'm convinced that proximity to the people you have a prejudice about will get you over it. Now, of course, there's some people that you're going to always feel badly about, like people that cut off other people's heads and so forth. You're going to feel badly toward them, of course, but I'm talking about the prejudice that's unreasonable. If you're with those people, like I bet no Ku Klux Klan people ever really had a friend who was black. Once you've spent time with people, you can get over prejudice. And that's something I really want to impress you with, because prejudice still goes on. One of the prejudices we had growing up was prejudice against new people that moved into our community. Now, that was silly, wasn't it? But in the 7th grade, a girl moved into our class at Glen Iris School, and she was new, and so we really gave her a hard time. And it was really mean when I think back on it. She had real thick glasses, and she wasn't pretty, and we gave her a hard time. One day, the teacher said that the new girl was sick, and somebody needed to take her homework to her. And nobody raised their hand, of course, no boy, no girl. And then she looked at me and said, "Douglas, you live at 647 Idlewild Circle, and her number is 605 Idlewild Circle. You must go right by her apartment." And she had me, so she gave me things to take to New Girl. Well, I had some friends in those big yellow apartments, but I didn't want to go in and see New Girl, and my plan was that I'd go halfway down the hall, and then when I found out where their door was, I would knock on it, and as soon as some mother opened the door, I'd hand the books in and I would run. That's what my plan was. Well, the mother, when she opened the door, stood back, and I couldn't reach her with the books, and she got me into the room. Well, then she got me into New Girl's bedroom. And at first I thought, what in the world? And then I looked at New Girl with her thick glasses and not being very pretty. And all of a sudden it struck me, she's not strong like I am. People don't like to look at her. But she looks in the mirror every morning and has to come on to school where people make fun of her. And all of a sudden I had a strong love for that girl. That was another one of those situations. And I never, after that, ever felt prejudice against somebody that was new, even if that person wasn't like the rest of our community. So prejudice is rampant. We haven't won civil rights yet by a long shot. You all read the newspapers, you know about some of the attempts to keep people from voting. But we can't go back and make a new start, but we can start here and make a new ending. Well, thank you so much for being so attentive. And do you want to take a little break and then we'll see Jason if they want to have any questions. Stand up and rest for a minute. I thought of a couple of other things I could mention before we have questions. To think of 63 in Birmingham was like the perfect storm. If we hadn't had Bull Connor and his tank and hoses and dogs, if we hadn't had the Ku Klux Klan, we hadn't had the bombings, all those things, it was like a perfect storm. And where Birmingham suffered so much from all that, it got it done. I mean, after Kennedy was killed in November, it was fairly easy for Johnson to move the civil rights bills on through. And I realized I didn't tell you what the accord was that was made in Birmingham in May of '63. The black leaders, except for Fred Shuttlesworth wanted a lot more than they got out of the accord, but all the others, realizing it was going national now, thought that it was better to limit what they got in the accord with the Birmingham leaders. And there were 5 things that were agreed on in that accord in May. Let's see if I've got those written down here. Well, I probably can remember them all. Let me see if I can find them, though. Fred Shuttlesworth was not happy about the accord. He wanted more. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Fred Shuttlesworth, too. The accord, there were 4 things. One is that all the black and white signs would be removed in downtown Birmingham. They didn't deal with the suburbs. Downtown Birmingham, all black and white signs would be moved. The desegregation of the downtown stores would begin. Before that, black people had to have their separate places where they could shop. Hiring of blacks in stores and city government, and we slowly started hiring blacks in stores and city government. And that those in jail would be released on bond because there were still hundreds and hundreds of the demonstrators in jail. And that a biracial committee, that was the 5th thing, would be set up that would keep it moving. My father ended up as head of the biracial committee to keep civil rights moving. And I found a letter from him to my brother that tells a lot about what was going on in those biracial committees. My brother was in Calcutta at that time, and from the news, he thought our father was just not doing a good enough job. And so Dad writes about that committee. And Fred Shuttlesworth had no fear. Are y'all familiar with him at all? There's a great biography of him that's called A Fire That Can't Go Out. And he didn't fear anything. But what he had started in Birmingham churches was that the black churches, almost all of them, met every Monday night. And in those Monday night meetings, they learned about Jesus and Gandhi. And they learned about nonviolent methods and how to remain nonviolent. So when people would say, we can't endorse civil disobedience because it'll lead to violence, it didn't lead to violence in Birmingham, not from the black community. It did in Chicago and California and places like that, but there people hadn't had that same church training on how to be nonviolent. But I don't know of any case where a black person used violence against a white person. They were just amazing, amazing people in their ability to, and of course that was part of what caught the attention of the nation too. They didn't fight back. Now in regard to the hoses and the dogs, since that's such a grim thing, let me tell you a funny thing about it. Andy Young, who of course was in the middle of all this, got an award called the Fred Shuttlesworth Award last year, and I went to the meeting for him to get that honor. And one of the things that Andy Young said, he said, you know, those fire hoses were pretty bad, but not many people got hurt by him. He said, now Fred Shuttlesworth got hurt, but he stood out there and got about 3 or 4 fire hoses on him at one time, and that put him in the hospital. He said, I didn't get hurt. I got behind a tree. And everybody just laughed and laughed. And then he said, and I don't know how to check this out any better, he said no one was ever bitten by one of those dogs. I mean, he would know if they had been. He said clothes were torn, but there was not anybody that was ever bitten. But that didn't make any difference because the pictures made it look like they were being bitten, and that's what caught the attention of the nation. The photojournalism was really amazing, really amazing. So about 8 or 10 years ago, Fred Shuttlesworth was back in Birmingham, and I had a short conversation with him. I wanted to have a lot more, but later when he moved back to Birmingham, he was so ill that when I went to see him, he couldn't really talk. I knew he would understand me because he would nod his head, but for the last year or two, and he spent the last couple of years in the Episcopal St. Martin's in the Pines nursing home. But about 10 years back, I talked to him on the street in Birmingham. He was down from Cincinnati. And the first thing I said is, Fred, Dr. oh, no, I remember. No, you don't call him Dr. Shuttleworth. He took that as an insult. He was not a doctor. Mr. Shuttlesworth, why did so many of the black leaders leave Birmingham when we needed you? Because he had moved to Cincinnati a number of years before the Civil Rights Movement. He just came back to be in the events of '63. He says, well, we were all on television so much when television started that we got calls to these big black churches in other parts of the country that paid good salaries and our families wouldn't get beat up. Because by that time, his house had been blown up. One time, he was blown right out of his bed by dynamite. His church was blown up. And I said, well, I can sure understand why you want me. He said, yeah, we had offers all over. And so he took a big church in Cincinnati and then came back for the demonstrations. I said, about my dad now, you all knew each other, because all those people knew each other then, blacks, whites in Birmingham. He said, yeah, your daddy and I disagreed on a few things, but we loved each other. And I thought, man, isn't that just great? That doesn't happen much today. It seems like today, if you disagree with somebody, you don't love them. You're either for them or against them. You're left or you're right. Very few people reach across the aisle, as they say in Congress. So I was hoping I could talk more with Fred Shuttlesworth when he came back, but he was really too ill to talk. But he was old by that time. And it's amazing he lived as long as he did. But he was afraid of nobody. He wasn't even afraid of Bull Connor. He would face down Bull Connor. And if you ever see a movie called Four Little Girls that Spike Lee did, have y'all ever seen that documentary? It's a great film, The Four Little Girls. Spike Lee does it. And there's a guy in the film who says, oh, yeah, I knew Bull Connor, and everybody thought he was mean to black people, but he was mean to white people, too. He said, I would see him down at the courthouse being just as mean to white people, and he was mean to everybody. And one of the other people in that film says, I used to hate Bull Connor, but when I found out he was crazy, I just quit hating him. But if you get a chance to see Four Little Girls by Spike Lee, and Chris McNair is the father of Denise McNair, and I got to know Chris McNair pretty well. I had lunch with him and talked a lot about that. He was a photographer and still has a nice, well, he's probably 90 years old now, but has a nice photography shop in Birmingham. And those black people whose girls were killed like that, and there were 2 black boys that were shot and killed that day too. How in the world they can be so forgiving? It's just amazing. And I think a lot of it's due to the fact of the strength of the churches back in the 50s and early 60s. And I guess the movement kind of helped make that happen. Well, do you all have anything else that you want to Yeah.
Mike, that's a question. Were you ever able to sit back and talk with your dad about, I'm sure you were, about some of the things that, what he felt during the time? I know in the book you expressed a great deal of that.
Yeah, we talked a lot. And at home, when we were teenagers, we used to really talk a lot. I went off to school when I was 15 and was gone a good bit after that. But one of the conversations we'd have at home was all of his children loved Camp McDowell. Some of y'all know about Camp McDowell up in Winston County. And it was segregated. And we would push him on going ahead and integrating Camp McDowell. And he would say, son, I know those people in Winston County. They would just burn the camp down. And as I got a little older, I realized he was probably right, because when I was a teenager and working at camp, the caretaker there, Marcus Goba, told us one day that he'd gone to his church that was close by in Winston County. And he said, the preacher was preaching against Camp McDowell because they think y'all are all communists out there. And we said, well, why do they think we're communists? He said, there's no American flag flying. You wear short pants. You've got to be communist. That's what the preacher was saying. Well, the head of Camp McDowell, Scott Epps, did put an American flag up. That's when that flagpole was put up in front of the mess hall. But we did keep wearing short pants. But it was a dangerous place. And he really, because of his experience with the Klan and so forth, he really knew that fast moves brought deaths. It didn't bring deaths to the white people. It brought deaths to the black people. And when we get to Selma, which is a tougher time to figure out, he knew that the Selma March would bring about deaths. And that's one reason he didn't feel like he could march with that group. He didn't believe in civil disobedience. And the reason he didn't believe in civil disobedience is because he thought that it would lead to violence and rioting. It didn't in Birmingham, but it did in California and Chicago and other places around the country where they hadn't had that church background about nonviolence. So if you were to criticize him, it would be that he should have had a little stronger view about civil disobedience being required at times, and a little more understanding about marches. He thought marches were power politics, and he believed so much in the democratic system. He believed too much in it, but he thought we could work things out, that we were getting things, that things were coming along. Well, you could see those as faults in him. But I was telling the newspaper man up here a minute ago, when I went over to see Rabbi Graffman, who was the only one of those 8 that the king let address that was still living in Birmingham, he said, you know, your father kept Birmingham from burning down. He said, and I said, what do you mean? He said, well, everybody respected him, even people that disagreed with him respected him. And I think that's what kind of kept the Klan at bay. Of course, we didn't fear that the black people would burn down Birmingham. I've grown up knowing that black people were good. I mean, I'm prejudiced in the favor of black people because all the black people I've known have had good hearts. And I've known some really bad white people. So I have to work on that a little bit to realize that maybe it's necessary to think that black people can be as bad as white people. I mean, that could happen, particularly if they become politicians, maybe, or something. Question?
How did your father respond personally to the letter from Dr. King?
One of the things y'all need to know is that there was never a letter. Nobody saw that till weeks after it had been finished, when it was published first in a Quaker magazine and then in newspapers, and part of it was published in the New York Times. So it was, by the time he saw the letter, you know, we'd made the accord, he was head of a committee, things were moving along. But when he read it, here's what happened. He first saw it, and I don't know how many weeks after after that he saw it. But I think he was reading it in a newspaper, and his assistant, Bishop George Murray, who's also named in the letter, was in his office there in Birmingham at Carpenter House, and they read the letter all the way through. And when they finished, my father said to Bishop Murray, "George, this is just something you have to live with. If you do anything at all, you're going to be hit from both sides." And that's been quoted in a lot of the things after that. Another very interesting thing that George Murray heard in his office was the Klan used to call him up and threaten him. And that didn't seem to bother him whatsoever. And he didn't seem to worry about his family from Klan threats. But Bishop Murray was in his office one time when the Ku Klux Klan called him up. And on the telephone, they were telling my father that they would ride him out of rail they would ride him on a rail out of town. I had to look up what that meant. Do y'all know what it means when they say we're going to ride you on a rail out of town? Or ride you out of town on a rail? I had to look it up. Way back in our history, if they wanted to really be vicious to somebody, they would tie him to a fence rail, tar him and feather him, and then pull him behind a horse out of town. And that was riding you out of town on a rail. I'd always thought it had something to do with railroad tracks or something, but that's what it originally meant. And my father knew that original meaning, so George Murray heard him say, "Well, old fella, maybe you better come over to my office and try one on for size." And of course, nobody showed up. I'll tell you this other thing about him, because y'all would probably be interested. Are any of you wrestlers? Any of y'all on the wrestling team? But do y'all have a wrestling team? Well, my father was the Eastern Intercollegiate Heavyweight Wrestling team when he was a student at Princeton. And so people always thought of him as being pretty strong. In fact, he was such a good wrestler that the Strangler Lewis's trainer, now you all would know Strangler Lewis, but Strangler Lewis was known as the world's champion heavyweight wrestler. He outweighed my father by about 50 pounds, which made him a pretty good-sized fella. And my father's coach at Princeton talked to Strangler Lewis's trainer and said, "I've got a young college man that can beat Strangler Lewis." Well, it turned out that they worked up that they would meet in New York at the athletic club, and they would wrestle. Well, my father knew Princeton wouldn't approve. Princeton was kind of a gentleman's place before there were women there, gentleman's place, and they wouldn't think kindly about somebody wrestling a professional. So he was posed as a masked marvel. And I've still got pictures of him in the New York Times and other places with a mask on him. So he shows up in New York. And since professional wrestlers in those days would wrestle 2-3 hours, and a college wrestling was 9 minutes. So I think sometimes it was 8, mostly 9 minutes. So they decided that the meet would only be for 20 minutes. And if Strangler couldn't pin my father in 20 minutes, then my father would win by decision. So he did. He won by decision against Strangler Lewis. And he never liked to talk about that much, but a lot of people knew. And when I wrote this book about him, one fella called me up and said, "Why didn't you include in the book the time your father wrestled a bear at the circus?" Well, he never wrestled a bear at a circus, but people have all kinds of stories, some of them true, some of them not true, about him. What was I answering the question about? Oh, my father's response to the letter. That's the only verbal response, really, that I know was, "George, if you try anything, you're going to get hit from both sides, but that's just what you have to live with." And he could take terrific abuse and not really, as far as we know, not let it bother him much. He was a very strong sort of person. In fact, he was so strong that in his last year, when he could hardly walk, nobody seemed to worry that much about him. And he came to Huntsville, to the church where I was, and bishops come and confirm people. And I presented a class of 35 for him to confirm. Well, I was going to have the first part of the service. And I looked over when it was time for him to preach, and he was sound asleep in a chair. Do y'all have a bishop's chair up here? Well, he was sitting over in the corner, and he had gone sound asleep in the church service. And so I woke him up, and he jumped up and thought the service was over and gave everybody a final blessing. And I said, "No, Dad, it's time to preach." And so then he preached a good sermon, and then I had to hold him up while he confirmed people. But everybody thought of him as such a strong person that they didn't worry about him even when he could hardly walk at all for the last few months of his work. Quite a character. And I think so often of that Anniston friend of his who in her old age said, "Oh, I wish that he and Martin Luther King could really have known each other," because they were both powerful speakers and both could cut the attention of many people. But if they had worked together in Birmingham, we wouldn't have had the commotion and wouldn't have passed the bills. I've even thought sometimes, what if the clergy, a lot of the clergy wear robes. What if they'd put their robes on and went out and marched with the little children? Well, then the fire hoses wouldn't have been turned on them probably. We wouldn't have had that. So it's hard to think what they could have done to make that perfect storm better. And it seemed to me that a lot of things, if they then would have calmed things down, it would have been just like Albany. It would just been another demonstration that didn't really get the attention of anybody. So you can kind of try to rethink that type of thing. And one of the things that I hope to do in this biography is it is really hard to change social customs. And when you think that he was only one generation away from plantation life, people have to really make quick changes. But we need to do it. And that 100-year stretch where the whole nation was so hesitant about seeing our black members as full citizens, it's really a bad time to think about. Everybody was saying, wait, wait, wait. And so when the 8 clergy say wait, it was a perfect opportunity for King to use that as a jumping off place. We've waited 100 years. We've waited 300 years. How many years? You know that as late as 1800, about 3/4 of the people of the world were in some kind of slavery. And one thing that surprised me about slavery is that Massachusetts was the first colony to make it legal in the colonies. And a lot of the slave trade came through Massachusetts. And sometimes I've thought, Massachusetts made a lot of money bringing slaves through and selling them to the South. They made a lot of money, and then they came down and beat up the South because they had the slaves they sold. Have you ever thought about that? There's just some strange things that have gone on. And I think it is perfectly good when Obama talks about how we have faults in this nation. But people on the right just jump all over. Oh, no, you're supposed to say that the United States is perfect. Well, we're not perfect. We came in here and killed Indians. And you know why we sent the Indians west? The Trail of Tears? Haiti had their revolution, and the slaves had gotten rid of the French people. People in the southeast began to think, if we have more and more slaves, if they get together with the Indians, they'll outnumber us, and they can take over. So that's when they started trying to get rid of the Indians. And you even can find that a lot of slaves were moved further west, say into Mississippi and places like that, because they began to fear them after they saw what had happened in Haiti. Another thing about Haiti that I didn't know till recently, we not only sent freed slaves to Liberia, we sent them to Haiti. And of course, that's a kind of a sad place to be, even now. I also found out that people always thought Baltimore and Maryland was really great because they sent so many freed slaves to Liberia. But when you read back into it, they're just trying to get rid of them. They didn't want them in Maryland. It was a kind of a selfish thing that a lot of that was about in the government of Maryland at that time. So history is an interesting study, isn't it? You can always uncover things and kind of rethink, but you can't go back and make a new start. We've got to start here. And boy, we have a lot of things to deal with today, don't we? Do you all watch television news or read the New York Times? Let me tell you this, though. We're reading about people being killed all the time. But in the First and Second World Wars, it wasn't thousands of people we're talking about being killed. It was millions of people. And we've come through that. I don't know how many million people were killed in both of the First and the Second World War. Plus, it was a world war. So what we're dealing with, is terrible. Of course, we know more about it because of communication. But we're not having the massive slaughter. Read some about the men that we sent over to France in the First World War, and they had to just get in trenches and kill Germans. And how the British came down and thought they could fight with horses, and all the horses got shot and killed, and there were just mass numbers of people murdered in those two wars. So maybe we'll get through what we're going through now. Does it make you want to go into politics or the military? Or what does it make you want to do? What holds it together? Of course, I can tell you what I decided. I feel like that congregations are really important in this country. And so I devoted, from the time I was 27 until I was 72, all that time to building up congregations, because I think, of course, some congregations do better than others, but I don't know what we would do without the religious congregations in this country. So that's why I decided to spend my life building up. And I'm sure that Michael's had something of the same decision.
Well, everybody, let's give Father